I'm Maren Cole, and I still remember the exact sound a federal badge case makes when it snaps shut on a conference table, because that's the sound that ended 11 years of my family thinking I was delusional. 3 men in dark suits sat across from a 2-star general in a windowless room at Fort Belvoir, and the general, Major General Thomas Ridgway, the officer who'd flown in personally to review the case, was holding my notebook like it was made of glass. He looked up, not at the JAG attorneys, not at the investigators, but at me. "Sergeant Cole," he said, and the room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. "This notebook is the only surviving documentation of what happened that night. Do you understand what you've been carrying around for 11 years? I didn't answer right away. I was too busy thinking about my brother's face 3 weeks earlier, laughing in my mother's dining room, holding that same notebook up like a dead mouse he'd found in a drawer. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back to a Sunday dinner that started like every other Sunday dinner in my family, which is to say, with my brother finding a way to make me small. My brother is Grant Cole, 2 years older than me, a regional sales manager who has never once in his adult life asked a follow-up question about anything I've said about my time in the Army. Grant had been going through boxes in my mother's attic that afternoon, helping her declutter, which mostly meant narrating everyone else's belongings out loud for an audience. When he pulled my old olive drab field notebook out of a shoebox, water-stained, rubber band snapped, edges soft from being carried in a cargo pocket through 2 deployments, he held it up like a prop in a bit. "You kept this trash all these years?" he said, grinning at the table, flipping it open to a random page of my handwriting, cramped, fast, half in shorthand only medics use. "What is this, your diary from playing Army?" A couple of cousins laughed. My mother didn't look up from her plate, which by then I'd learned to read as its own kind of answer. "My daughter is Ivy Cole, 16 at the time, sharp in a way that scared people twice her age, and she was the only person at that table who put her fork down." "Uncle Grant, stop," she said, flat, not even raising her voice, and something about a teenager saying it landed harder than if I had. Grant rolled his eyes and tossed the notebook back in the box like it had never mattered enough to hold his attention in the first place. I remember reaching over later, after everyone left, and running my thumb along the cover, feeling the dent where a piece of shrapnel had actually skipped off at once. Nobody at that table knew that. Nobody had ever asked. See, in my family, there's a version of my service that everyone's comfortable with, that I was a medic, that medics hand out band-aids and carry water, that whatever happened over there was probably fine, probably boring, probably not worth bringing up at dinner. I let them believe it for a long time because the truth was heavier than a Sunday table could hold. The truth was a notebook full of times, coordinates, casualty counts, and decisions I made in the dark that I still turn over some nights when the house is quiet. I was 23 years old, an Army combat medic attached to a small forward element outside a valley whose name doesn't matter anymore, on a night when our radios went down during contact and the after-action reporting chain broke somewhere between the field and battalion. What survived that night wasn't the official log, because there wasn't one, not really, not one that held up later. What survived was my handwriting, scrawled by red lens flashlight between triaging 2 wounded soldiers, because some instinct in me said someone needs to remember exactly what happened here, in order, with times attached. I didn't know then that someone would end up being 3 federal investigators, 11 years later, sitting in my living room. By the time Grant was mocking that notebook in my mother's dining room, I'd been an ER trauma nurse for 6 years, and the 2 lives sat next to each other in a way nobody at that table ever connected. On a Tuesday overnight shift not long after that dinner, a multi-vehicle pileup came in all at once, 4 patients, 1 trauma bay, and a second-year resident freezing over a chest that was filling with blood faster than anyone could chart it. I didn't freeze. I called it, I moved. I had a chest tube kit open before the attending finished asking for one, and afterward the attending pulled me aside just to say he'd never seen someone run a room like that without a title in front of their name. That's the version of me that exists at 3 a.m. in a trauma bay, the version my family has never once witnessed, because it doesn't come with a group text. Ivy saw it, though. She'd come by the hospital sometimes on her way home from a late study session, and she'd watch through the window in the family waiting area while I worked, And she never once said that's just her job. She understood, somehow, at 15 and 16, that competence like that doesn't come from nowhere, that it comes from somewhere you don't talk about at dinner. "You're not the person they think you are, Mom," she told me once in the car, not unkindly, more like she was handing me a fact I'd forgotten I owned. I didn't cry in front of her. I waited until she was asleep. The notebook itself had survived because I'd never been able to throw it away, not because I thought it mattered to anyone else, but because some nights it was the only proof I had that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. I kept it wrapped in a plastic bag in the bottom of a filing cabinet for years, moved it through 4 apartments and a house, and every time Grant made some version of his playing army joke, I told myself it didn't matter what he believed. I decided, somewhere around that dinner, that I was done letting that decision be passive. If the record of that night was ever going to mean something, I wasn't going to leave it to chance in a shoebox in my mother's attic. I was going to find out, quietly, whether what I'd written down still mattered to anyone who could actually do something with it. I didn't tell Grant what I started doing. I barely told Ivy at first, because I didn't want to build up a hope that might collapse into nothing. What I did was start with the Army's own channels, because I wasn't interested in going around the system. I wanted the system itself to have to look at what it had lost. I filed a formal request through the Board for Correction of Military Records, attaching a written statement and a description of the notebook's contents, asking that the historical record of that engagement be reviewed against contemporaneous field documentation that had never been formally logged. It took 2 months just to get an acknowledgement, and in that time I did the unglamorous work nobody puts in the highlight reel. I tracked down a former squadmate, Corporal Danny Ferris, the radio operator that night, now working as an HVAC contractor in Ohio, who remembered enough details to corroborate the timeline in my handwriting almost sentence for sentence. I requested my own service medical records and after-action summaries through official channels to build a paper trail showing the gap where the missing log should have been. I photographed every page of the notebook myself, in order, with timestamps, before I let it leave my hands for anything, because some part of me that had learned hard lessons in triage bays knew that if this mattered, someone would eventually try to say it didn't exist, or didn't happen the way I said. I built my case the way I'd build a chart on a critical patient, methodical, sourced, nothing left to memory alone. What I didn't expect was for the request to travel further than the Army Review Board itself, landing on a desk that had been quietly reopening a much bigger question than I'd realized I was part of. The black SUV pulled into my driveway on a Thursday afternoon in October. And I watched from the kitchen window as 2 agents in plain suits walked up to my door with a folder I would come to know very well. My daughter was doing homework at the counter, and she looked up first, before I did, and said, "Mom, who is that?" I opened the door already half certain this was about a mistake, a misdirected letter, something explainable. It wasn't. The lead investigator introduced herself, Special Agent Renata Kwan, from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and asked, with a level of formality that made my stomach drop, whether I still had in my possession a personal field notebook from my deployment 11 years earlier. It turned out my correction of records request had crossed paths with an entirely separate federal inquiry, one that had been quietly building for over a year into how that night's incident had been reported up the chain, specifically, whether a private contractor's account of the engagement, the one that had shaped official findings for over a decade, had been accurate. My notebook wasn't just a sentimental keepsake anymore. It was, as Agent Kwan put it, standing in my front hallway, potentially the only surviving contemporaneous account that contradicts the official record. I remember Ivy standing in the kitchen doorway, absolutely silent, watching her mother's hands shake for the first time in her life. I asked for a minute, went to the filing cabinet, and pulled out the plastic bag I'd carried through 4 moves, and something in me, some old, tired, unspoken ledger I'd been keeping since I was 23, finally felt like it might be allowed to close. The hearing was scheduled 6 weeks later, not a courtroom exactly, but a formal DoD Inspector General Review Board convened in a secure conference facility, which felt, walking in, exactly as serious as any courtroom I'd ever imagined. Grant found out I'd been asked to testify because our mother mentioned it, confused, at another family dinner, saying something like apparently the Army wants to talk to Marin about her old notebook, and I watched my brother's face do something complicated, somewhere between confusion and the beginning of an apology he didn't yet know how to give. I didn't explain it to him. I let him sit in that confusion, because for once, I wasn't going to soften the ground for him. Ivy insisted on coming, even though she wasn't required to be there, and she sat in the small gallery of family and council with her hands folded the exact way I fold mine when I'm trying not to show how scared I am. Across the table sat representatives for the contractor whose account had shaped the original findings, 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage, flanking a man named Carl Devereaux, a former operations manager for the firm, who had given the original statement that contradicted everything in my notebook. He looked, when I first sat down, like a man who had never once considered that a 23-year-old medic's handwriting might outlast his company's version of events. Major General Ridgway presided over the review, flanked by 2 JAG officers and Agent Kwan, and he opened by having my notebook entered into the record, page by page, cross-referenced against Corporal Ferris's corroborating statement, which had been taken by deposition the week before. I testified for almost 2 hours, walking through that night minute by minute, and there's a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when you're not performing composure, you're just being precise, because precision was the only thing I trusted myself to survive on that night 11 years ago. Devereaux's attorneys tried, twice, to suggest the notebook could have been altered or reconstructed after the fact, and both times Agent Kwan calmly produced the ink analysis and paper aging report the investigation had already commissioned, which dated every page to within the deployment window itself. It was during a recess, not even the formal ruling, that the moment happened, the one that had been sitting at the front of this whole story since the beginning. General Ridgway asked to speak with me privately for a moment before reconvening, and he held the notebook out, not to take it, but to show me a page I'd forgotten I'd written, a line jotted in the margin time-stamped almost to the minute of the worst of it, 2 down, holding position, will not leave them. He looked at me for a long moment. Sergeant Cole, in 11 years of reviewing contested incident reports, I have never seen documentation this disciplined from someone that young, under that kind of fire. You didn't just save lives that night. You preserved the truth when everyone around you had every reason not to. When we reconvened, he read a formal finding into the record stating that the contractor's original account was materially inconsistent with contemporaneous evidence, and that the record of the engagement would be corrected to reflect my documented account as the operative version. Devereaux didn't say a word. His attorneys didn't either. I watched 11 years of being quietly disbelieved get overwritten by a 2-star general reading my own handwriting back to a room that had no rebuttal left. The finding took another 4 months to fully process through the correction board, but when it did more than just fix my file. General Ridgway, it turned out, had been pushing for over a year for a change to how field documentation was handled after incidents like mine, cases where communications failures meant a soldier's personal notes became the only surviving record, and where those notes had historically been treated as informal, disposable, unofficial. My case became the cited precedent. 6 months after the hearing, the Department of Defense issued a formal directive requiring that personal field logs recovered after any incident involving a communications or reporting failure be treated as primary evidentiary documents, preserved and reviewed with the same weight as official after-action reports, not filed away as a curiosity in someone's attic. Corporal Ferris called me the week the directive was announced, laughing in that dry way people who've been through something together laugh, and said, "Guess your terrible handwriting just became federal policy." I laughed too, for the first time in a long time, about all of it. Ivy framed a photocopy of that margin note, 2 down, holding position, will not leave them, and gave it to me for my birthday that year, and it hangs in my hallway now, not the original, because the original lives in a federal archive with acid-free paper and a climate-controlled drawer, which is a strange kind of ending for something that used to live in a shoebox. Grant called me eventually, weeks after the ruling became public within the family, and it wasn't a dramatic apology, which honestly suited us both better. He asked if he could see the notebook again, the real one, before it went to the archive for good, and I let him hold it, and I watched him actually read a page this time instead of flipping through it for a laugh. I didn't know, he said, and I told him that was exactly the problem, not that he didn't know, but that he'd never once asked. He's different now, not perfect, but different. He asks questions now, actual ones, and last year he was the one who told the story at Thanksgiving, correctly, without embellishing it into something it wasn't. I sat there and let him. I still work trauma nights sometimes, though less than I used to, and every so often a young medic or a nursing student asks me why I keep a battered little notebook in my scrub pocket even now, jotting times and details nobody's asked for yet. I tell them the same thing I wish someone had told me at 23, write it down anyway, even if no one believes it matters yet, because you don't get to choose which page ends up being the one that saves you. If this story meant something to you, stick around, there are more like it here, about the quiet ones who kept their receipts, and I promise you, they're worth the watch.